Hi, everybody. This is Tamara Kirby. I'm with the SUDEC Substance Use Committee, and I'd just like to introduce Jackie real quick. Jackie is a clinical social worker and recovery addict and recovery advocate and a person in long-term recovery. And she's also my boss. So super happy to have her here today sharing with us. And I'm just going to be super quick because we got started a little bit late. But she is going to be sharing with us empowering recovery and challenging the stigma through language. So let's give it up to Jackie Daniels.
Thank you, Tamara. So as Tamara said, I'm going to be presenting on how to empower recovery, and we're going to do that through challenging the stigma associated with language in our society and culture related to substance use and recovery. So I'm just going to jump right in. There we go. So I want to direct your attention to this quote in part because what we know from research is that evidence shows that the word choices that we use impacts perception, and also related to substance use, it affects the treatment that we provide to folks with substance use disorder. And what we're going to talk about today really is how explicit and implicit bias affects perception, and basically how that shows up through the everyday words that we use to address substance use and addiction. And so I'm sure you're wondering, but I think most of you that have some sensitivity towards substance use, whether it's you've lost somebody to overdose, you're a person in recovery, you might be a healthcare provider, or just a concerned community member. The reason this matters and why we talk about stigma so much is this football stadium, basically. So this is the Houston Texans football stadium, very big, and 72,000 people can fit in this stadium. What we know is that in 2017, the entire contents of this football stadium lost their lives to drug overdose. The impact of stigma in its worst form is that it keeps people isolated. It keeps people from asking for help. It makes them feel separated and different. And in its worst form, it has the power to kill people. So I'm not trying to be dramatic, but in terms of addressing stigma, it's life or death. And that's part of the reason why I talk about it. One, because it has the effect of changing people's lives for the worst. So I have some assumptions when I make this presentation, and here's a few on the screen, and they're actually not mine. I stole them from the Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, which is a recovery community organization on the East Coast that I highly respect and follow quite a bit. So I stole them from them with permission because I like them so much. So I have a few assumptions for why you're attending or watching this presentation. The first one is that you have kind of a foundational knowledge that recovery is not always as extreme as we think it is. So it's not simply abstinence. Sometimes it's harm reduction. Sometimes it's another pathway. But my assumption is that somebody's in recovery when they say they are. The second assumption I have is that most of you are aware or would like to be aware that there are many pathways to recovery. It doesn't always look like what you would expect it to be, like in the movie 28 Days with Sandra Bullock. It doesn't always look like that. I also like to support the fact that we need to look at people's potential as opposed to pathology. So you'll hear me use some terms that come from I guess some clinical documentation or books that I've consulted with, like our diagnostic manuals. But I also want all of us to support the fact that everybody has the power to get better. And also, as the Indiana Recovery Alliance said originally, we want to focus on any positive change. I also would like to assume that the recovering community, especially in Bloomington or locally, statewide, or nationally, includes not only the individuals in recovery or currently struggling with substance use, but it also includes you. So if you don't personally identify as in recovery, you are a member of the recovering community simply by existing alongside people in recovery in this community. I also assume that you're tuned in today because you are already, or you would like to challenge your thinking. And this is a perfect presentation to do that, in part because there are some controversial points that I make. But the reason they're controversial is because it's a change of perspective, and it's a change of how we've been talking about these issues for so long. So thanks for hanging in there with me. So first, the other assumption I make is that you're tuning in because the subject of addiction or substance use means something to you. And maybe you already understand or could describe what addiction looks like in our community. And I have a tendency to rely on the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and then also other common models that we use in healthcare practice. So for example, addiction is identified as a disease, and we can look at functional MRIs and identify how brains of people that are using substances are different from other people. And we also know, related to that, that without treatment, or at least creation of a new community and connections, that addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. Very similar to other conditions that we talk about, such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer. So it's not too far detached. The other model that I talk about is the biopsychosocial spiritual model. This is relevant simply because addiction, we can describe it using the functional MRIs that I mentioned and looking at people's brains, but that sometimes ignores the fact that there are other societal conditions that can lead somebody down the path of addiction, whether it's trauma, poverty, another co-occurring or mental illness, maybe the neighborhood that they live in. It can be a whole myriad of other things too. So keep those two things in mind as we talk about this. Related to addiction, and this is why knowing the definition is important. So if you are like me, you probably are on a social media or some kind of social networking site. I am primarily on Facebook, and I often look at the what's going on in Bloomington Facebook page, and then other local pages. And once in a while, I see a post from somebody condemning or mentioning something that they see in the community related to substance use. And typically it is very punitive and I don't know another word, judgy. Let's use that word. It's judgy. And I did some research on kind of the impact of stigma because those posts were so disheartening to me. So in my search for information about stigma and, you know, why people feel or think this way, these are the lessons that I learned. So first, stigma can be defined as basically disapproval or discrediting of somebody's humanity, and then subsequently discriminating against them because of perceived social characteristics. So not necessarily proven social characteristics, but perceived. What we also know is that stigma related to addiction is multifaceted. We can't simplify it. We can't explain it using very simplistic terms because for most of us, it goes back decades. And if you're younger, then good for you because you did not survive the just say no generation like I did in the 80s and other prevention programs that really kind of ingrained in me the idea that drugs are bad and whoever does drugs is also bad. So two interesting characteristics to be aware of related to stigma. One is cause. So cause influences stigma in part because if you believe that an individual is not responsible for the attribute, the behavior that they're demonstrating or the condition, then we automatically believe that it's not their fault. Because we have views out there that addiction is somehow a moral decision or dilemma, that somebody could stop if they want to, that somebody is choosing, for example, to get up every day and inject drugs and sacrifice families, jobs, and things of that nature. it increases stigma basically because we believe that it's their fault. The second factor to think about as far as social kind of perception related to addiction is controllability. So for example, similar to cause, but if the attribute, behavior, or condition is beyond somebody's control, for example, they just can't control it. So to compare this to another health condition, if I am born with a congenital disease, or I am born with, a genetic disability of some sort, most people do not look at me and say, wow, that is really her fault, or she can control it. Most of the time there is some empathy and some compassion and some understanding that it's not my fault, nor did I cause it. When it comes to substance use, so many of our beliefs stem from what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, which really is how we have been kind of raised and socialized to think about addiction, that somewhere in our culture, there's this huge misunderstanding that people with substance use cause it, and that they also can control it if they want to. Huge misunderstandings. And here's an example of how this plays out in our culture. So I've known many families affected by a cancer diagnosis. My own family's been affected by it. And what I notice among networks of people that I've known my entire life is that when somebody is diagnosed with cancer, there is very much a coming together of the community to rally around the family and to rally around the person struggling with cancer, depending on how isolated they are socially. This is not true across the board for everyone. But there's a whole lot of empathy and sympathy and compassion that comes up in our communities. And part of that is this idea of cause and control. If I'm diagnosed with cancer that cannot be explained by my own behavior, sometimes there is a lot of empathy and sympathy that comes my way in other people's ways. And usually, and this is probably, I don't want to simplify it in this way, but a lot of people will cook you a casserole. So after a funeral from losing somebody to cancer, there is food trains, GoFundMe accounts set up to help with funeral costs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely an idea that if somebody is struggling with a health condition that is acceptable or socially acceptable, you're going to make them a casserole and you're going to take it to their house and they're going to be very grateful, and it's not going to be a secret. In contrast, I am also a person in recovery, and that's part of the reason why I'm motivated to do these presentations. But I remember going to treatment myself about 20 years ago, and nobody brought my family a casserole. Nobody said, we're really grateful that she's getting help for this. And part of it was secretive and it was shameful. So nobody really brought my family a casserole or really checked in to see how they were doing while I was away. So moving on to explicit and implicit bias and how this causes stigma, but also supports it in our culture and society. What we know about stigma is that it has two components. So one is a label and the other one is a stereotype. The label in this sentence, the addict is lazy, is the addict. That is a label. And then the stereotype is that they're lazy. So for example, somebody who, and I don't really even need to give you examples. I think we see it all the time in the media. People that smoke pot all day, eat pizza and never leave their house. And then people that are addicted and subsequently on welfare don't work, and it's because they're lazy. So these are examples of how stigma kind of shows up in the media, but also in our everyday assumptions about people. Explicit bias, as you may know already, is that it's very conscious bias that we have towards people or a group of people. So typically we are aware of it. And a perfect example that we're seeing a lot of today is overtly racist language that is very explicit. So if I were to call somebody a racist name, then I am demonstrating my explicit bias. I am basically separating myself from that person or the group of people that I am attacking. The second kind that is kind of more insidious is implicit bias. Implicit bias is typically unconscious, mostly unknown, and definitely involuntarily formed. And I sometimes liken it to, we're all socialized to believe certain things, whether it's the schools we attend, the families that we grow up in, or the media. And just through being raised in our culture, we see these messages all the time, and that helps us develop our beliefs and the way that we see the world. So a lot of the beliefs that we have that are implicit or implicit bias is completely unaware. And usually the way it shows up is that we have these automatic preferences for certain types of people. So for example, if I go to a predominantly white or Caucasian school and I am very familiar and don't expose myself to cultures that are different than me or people of color, I may have this kind of unknown automatic preference for certain types of people that look like me. And I think what is awesome about you kind of taking part in this presentation is most of you probably are already in the habit of identifying your own bias. I think in our culture today, the political atmosphere is really difficult not to be triggered by certain pieces of information or things that we see on TV related to politics or our culture. Just with the rioting and the to me, it's a revolution that's happening right now. So a lot of the revolution is based on people calling attention to implicit bias that's happening every day. So why does this even matter? Why it matters is because it's been studied. The science and research point to the impact on several practices in our daily world, but also in individuals that it's affecting. So one of those groups is behavioral health professionals, which I am included in as a clinical social worker, as are most of my colleagues and people that I've spent my career with. And what they've identified is that when it comes to bias and stigma among behavioral health professionals, it affects how we deliver services to the people struggling with substance use or struggling with addiction. And really what that means is in some studies, they have found that a behavioral health care professional is willing to spend 25 sessions of therapy with somebody struggling with depression. But on the flip side, maybe that same professional is limiting themselves to brief therapy or 3 to 10 sessions. And they're completely unaware of it as well if addressing somebody with a substance use disorder. It also affects how punitive sometimes our interventions or treatment approaches can be. One, because addiction is highly criminalized, and we see it a lot in the criminal justice system, that treatment is typically recommended through punitive approaches. But again, the process of delivering services can also be punitive. So I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I'm sure that you've seen it in your everyday work in this community. The other group that we know this impacts are medical practitioners. And I have a story to share about this. In one case, I can think of folks where we work at Indiana Center for Recovery going to the emergency room for a completely separate medical emergency. And when asking the patient what medications they're prescribed or not prescribed, and the patient says, I can't take opiates and it's because I'm in treatment and I'm trying to avoid opiates, sometimes the medical practitioner's energy and focus on the patient decreases. And what we know is that typically the scope of medical intervention is limited based on the practitioner's knowledge that somebody is struggling with substance use or addiction. It also decreases the amount of time that they're willing to spend with patients. And then the general public. So I think most of us are aware of stigma at play in our communities, but here are some examples of how it continues to show up for us. So it's written into policies, whether small community or federal policies, basically stating a common one that we dealt with recently is this argument about people seeking welfare benefits in the state of Indiana and around the US having to complete a urine drug test. I'll just leave that right there. The other issue that we have in our communities is this idea of not in my backyard. The Indiana Center for Recovery experienced a great deal of this when we first were open and operating. And some of it was this idea that I've heard in other kind of zoning hearings with planning departments all over Indiana, is, we really support your services. We just don't want it here. Put it somewhere else. And then when you put it somewhere else, those people want it somewhere else. So it's constantly this debate of where does treatment belong, if not in each one of our communities. The other way that this impacts the general public is through employment policies. So some of that has to do with reentry from incarceration. Some of it has to do with drug testing policies and procedures, and then also general employment policy. And then we also get into this debate about housing. And a lot of this overlaps with folks that are leaving incarceration, folks with felonies. And remember, felonies can be obtained through repeated drug offenses, some of them pretty small. So repeated possession of marijuana, for example. These don't have to be major criminal offenses that are basically affecting somebody's ability to find a job, live in a neighborhood, get housing, and have benefits as well. And of course, there's a lot of research on how stigma impacts people who use drugs and those that are in recovery. And one example that I use just from my own time in recovery is the experience of trying to get life insurance. And again, I understand insurance. I understand the pressure that they're under. However, as an adult, I was doing some adulting 101 and I decided to seek life insurance because I have a family and my husband and I did it together. However, my husband's also in recovery. When we finally got to the part where they let us know if we were going to get a policy or not, they basically said, because you have a history of drug use and you have sought treatment, we are going to be unable to insure you. And I thought of all the pre-existing conditions I could have, there were a lot of other ones that I thought would get in my way of having life insurance. And never did I think that substance use would preclude me from that. And part of the reason that I thought I was okay is that it had been 20 years. I have not used drugs or drank alcohol in 20 years. And I thought that's a good amount of time to show people that my risk is somehow managed, sorry. The other way that this shows up for folks in recovery or people that are currently using is the constant shame, the guilt, and also the internalized stigma. And the internalized stigma has this impact where if you're struggling with a mental health condition or substance use, this idea that you're going to ask for help willingly and freely it's always curious to me how people think without kind of reaching out a hand that people are going to seek help. That's why programs like screening and brief intervention referral to treatment is so important, because you're meeting people in areas where they may be every day. So for example, a doctor's office, a community health clinic, and other places in communities, which decreases this internalized stigma and inability really to ask for help in a comfortable and safe way. Who cares? So I keep coming back to this idea of, why do we even have this conversation and why does it matter? And what I know, as I said before, is that the language that we use to talk about social issues or criminal issues or health conditions influences based on that research that I shared, and also reflects our attitudes and approaches to addressing the social or criminal issues. So for example, if I am not advocating for non-stigmatizing language, or I am not, writing a letter to the editor of the Herald Times talking about why, posting a picture of somebody overdosing is not a good idea, or kind of sensationalizing drug use, then I'm really kind of, enabling a lot of the stigma that's happening today. And so I think really to unpack some of the stigma, we also as a culture and society need to recognize where it came from in the first place. So I did a lot of kind of self-searching, read a lot of books, and started to look at how my own beliefs and ideas about drug use formed. And in 5th grade, we had the DARE program. And I remember in my elementary school, especially in Bloomington, Officer Friendly used to come in and I loved him. He was very kind and nice, and I think still lives in the community, Officer Jim Graff. But the impact of that on me was that I loved the information and the materials, and I started to identify this belief that if you do drugs, you're bad. I don't know that anybody ever told me that, but there were plenty of images of people in handcuffs. And of course, I'm thinking as a young child, then that's not good if they're in handcuffs. They're going to jail. And I automatically think if you use drugs, then you must be bad. So I started to look at how these programs and also these ideas kind of developed in myself, but also in other people. And a lot of this goes back to early in the 19th century. So it didn't start in this century. It didn't start in this decade. We've been dealing with this for a very, very long time. And it's really impossible to talk about stigma or the drug war without also talking about our history in the United States of oppressing people of color, and also disenfranchising people of color and the immigrant populations. And I found this really interesting quote by a Nixon policy advisor who was interviewed in the 90s, and then they published his book in the new millennium. And I think he had some other ones that came out in the 90s where he basically dropped the curtain on the Nixon administration, talking about why the drug war came to be and how it was another form of social control. And I think more of us are kind of realizing and seeing this as we kind of uncover and explore topics of mass incarceration against involving especially Black men in the United States, but all people of color. So that was one thing that kind of perked my attention, and was not necessarily something that I learned in school or graduate school, or was even presented to me in governance classes in college, for example, in my political science classes. I also want to point out, if you're not kind of already aware of the United States drug laws, similar to what this Nixon policy advisor had to say, we can also point back at our earliest drug laws in the United States and identify exactly when they happened and what wave of immigration was also happening around the same time. So for example, in 1875, the United States passed basically the first drug law and outlawed opium dens, and also started, I guess, investigating opiates a little bit more. But what we know is that the intention behind it really was to stop the Chinese immigrants that had come over to work on the Transcontinental Railroad from smoking opium, because they were somehow less than the rest of the United States culture. We saw it again in 1914 when the Harrison Tax Act was passed, which definitely affected the use of cocaine for medical purposes. And the belief at that time was that African-American men who were, so-called freed from slavery were still experiencing this oppressive policy, with the hopes that if we outlawed cocaine, then somehow these African-American men or Black men in the early, sorry, I said 19th century, didn't I? I meant the 20th century. I'm waking up now. Would effectively disenfranchise and take away the ability for them to feel comfortable in American society. The next one was in 1937 and impacted marijuana and cannabis that was directly tied to Mexican migrants and people that were resettling from Mexico into the United States. What we also know around the same time that these early drug laws were passed is that the language started to change. So in the earliest readings that I have found, the inebriates word, which makes me chuckle a little bit thinking about it now, but in the early 20th century, this word was used to describe folks that had trouble with alcohol. And typically the treatment for them was to put them in a sanitarium, dry them out, provide some vitamin treatments, and then let them go back out to where they had come from. We know now that some of the language around that time was created really to create a social divide and a separation, especially if you look at movies such as Reefer Madness, for example. Most of us have taken a look at this movie and we can see how entirely propagandized it is in the movie, and how you have to watch it if you haven't watched it, and it will basically demonstrate exactly what we're talking about today. It was definitely propaganda that was meant to separate certain groups of people from the rest of us simply because they were using marijuana. In the late 1960s into the 1970s, and then in the 1980s with the Reagan administration, the war on drugs was declared. And I think most of us now, looking back on the policy and the intention of it and the mass incarceration that kind of came from the drug war, we can see that it was really a war on people and not so much a war on drugs. Nixon really needed a way to control the anti-war movement, but then also continue to oppress people of color in the United States for his own political gain and also policy gain around those in those decades. And part of that was the war on drugs. And then following that in the Reagan administration, we had the Just Say No movement, which also led to some criminal justice reform and harder sanctions on drug use, but also things like possession. And from that, we also saw later on the 3 strikes rule, which definitely we saw a misproportionate number of people of color ending up in jail and basically with life sentencing too. And in the 1980s, if you were around, you probably remember the crack crisis that a lot of people will say was manufactured in certain communities in order to create this sensational idea that crack cocaine was invading our neighborhoods, and therefore in the inner cities where a lot of our people of color were concentrated, were really responsible for this crack epidemic we had. And if you compare the crack epidemic to the opioid epidemic that we're having now, you will definitely see huge differences. So I encourage you to look at that. What we also know is that has basically all of this brainwashing that we have experienced, and I don't use that word brainwashing as accusatory. I use it because I feel like personally I was incredibly brainwashed and sensitive to information that was given to me in educational programs in our neighborhoods, on media billboards and on TV, way before I even understood what information literacy or media literacy really was, before I was able to really make a decision about what I believed and how I wanted to feel about different groups of people. What we've noticed is that this has translated again back into policy, but also how we on a daily basis in for some people, very minute ways, continue to discriminate against people that struggle with substance use, that may have a criminal background related to drug possession or drug use, something related to the fact that they are addicted. So for example, I may steal something because I am experiencing the impact of withdrawal, and I know that if I don't get my drugs, I'm going to be very sick. I would like to think that that person is not a bad person. They are doing it for survival and not doing it because they want to wreak havoc on our communities. It does not mean that we don't have to have a response to that, but I do think that we need to take a look at what helped that person get there in the first place. And I'm hoping that this information will also help increase some compassion when it comes to issues like that in our community. Okay, so one particular research study that I want to point you to is by an acquaintance or a former colleague named Robert Ashford and some of his colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. And this is actually the study that kind of turned me on to looking at language and how in a very simple way we can impact stigma just by changing some words. And it seems very simplistic, but the reality is it's backed up by science. So I always share this. What they did in particular studies and also other studies that they've conducted is they've investigated the impact of certain words on how those words basically increase or decrease implicit and explicit bias, which we know can lead to how we see stigma show up in our everyday lives, and specifically how it affects those with substance use disorders, also the health professionals that work with them, and then also the general public. I also want to point attention to this nice gentleman up in the right-hand corner of your screen right now, Michael Botticelli. and also Diana Williams, which some of you may know Diana Williams from DMHA in the state of Indiana. So Michael Botticelli was the director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy during the Obama administration. He was also the first federally recognized individual in recovery and was able to support the change of language at a federal level. And right before he left for his new position on the East Coast, he sent out a memo to federal offices related to changing language. So for example, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA, would have gotten a memo from Michael Botticelli recommending that they drop the word abuse from their title. And I'll talk about that word specifically in a moment. But what he did was, it was huge for people in recovery. It was huge for him to identify that way at a federal level. He basically became my idol in that moment because he was out there and he was proud about his recovery, and he supported us at a federal level and basically had a seat at the tables of policymakers. And this is kind of a surprise for a lot of people, but this quote on your screen comes from our particular article where a certain body of journalistic professions were highlighted. And I always tell people, you know, guess who said this thing in quotations. And you'll be very surprised, I think, on one hand, because it hasn't necessarily made its way down to every avenue of journalism, whether it's print media or television journalism. We just haven't seen it change as much as we need to yet. So the professional organization that put this out is the Associated Press. They basically send out something called a style book each year, and this was in the book for 2017. So here we are 3 years later, and the language that is continuing to be used from the media, but also in on TV and things like that, doesn't always respect the worth and dignity of all persons. It's not always people first language. It's typically the addict or the user, the drug abuser, the substance abuser. It's those kinds of words that we're actually addressing right now, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have learned all kinds of wonderful things from the advocacy movements that have gone before the recovery advocacy movement. And there's some that I want to point out because they are so important, and what these movements have learned but also taught people is that you can't really make a social change, one, without making some noise, but two, also involving the people that are being addressed in the advocacy movement. So for example, in the recovery advocacy movement nationwide, it's really important to get people in recovery at the table. And I think that we see this in mental health care as much as we see it in substance use treatment, which to me is not separate. But we've seen it, you know, in the Me Too movement with women and men that have struggled or been victims of sexual assault. We've seen it in all of these other movements that are on your screen right now. The earliest one that I can recall is when HIV and AIDS basically became a named condition back in the early, mid, and late 80s. I was greatly impacted by watching how discrimination for that disease took place in our culture, but also the impact it had with people struggling with the disease and how they were kind of isolated and not provided quality treatment, not only because people didn't understand the condition, but also because it was so stigmatized. And I'm glad that today we can say that people are living undetectable and definitely with more access, not perfect access, but more access to care. So I'm really proud of that. And I'm hoping that the recovery advocacy movement can also move in that direction too. So before I kind of get to the end of this, this is the slide in which I'm going to outline some of the words that you as individuals participating in this presentation today can change immediately. And I have to warn you, it's not always comfortable. One, because you'll find yourself correcting yourself all the time. And I want to let you know that, be gentle with yourself. We are not perfect people. And I also don't think that you have to be hard on yourself if you are continuing to make an effort to reduce stigma. So there are certain words that we want to eliminate from our everyday vocabulary, from titles of organizations. I love that the Substance Use Disorder Commission is using substance use disorder as opposed to drug addiction, or another term that could be definitely more stigmatizing, the Substance Abuse Commission. So we want to basically eliminate anything that is not person-centered. And this is a lesson that we pulled from the disability advocacy movement, from people with disabilities, is that their humanity comes first. And the same can be said for substance use and the people that are using drugs. One, I'm a human being first, and I'm also a human being who has struggled with substance use and other mental health conditions, but that is not the entirety of my being. The second is addict and alcoholic. And these are particularly sensitive words for a lot of us in recovery, because there are certain avenues in which we say these things, but it's not in a pejorative or prejudicial way. It's very much a word that connects us to other people that are like us. Another word is relapse, which definitely to me is connected to shame, and also this belief that relapse is a bad thing. And the reality is that sometimes bad things come from relapse, but it's also, for a lot of individuals, what helps them get to long-term recovery, and is not necessarily because they're bad people or that they've done something wrong. Another term that we hear a lot is clean or dirty. So for example, if I said to somebody, your urine drug test at your job is dirty, what that tells me is that the individual is dirty. So it's really hard to kind of separate the two. And also, if their urine drug test, for example, for employment is clean, then I would assume that that means they're clean. And to me, it will seem like a giant leap, but I also recognize how I feel differently when I don't use those terms. The words that make my skin crawl, and I'll tell you a funny story about why, are the words abuse and abuser. So in the research that I mentioned earlier by Robert Ashford and his colleagues, study the impact of words like substance abuse and substance abuser, and how they increased implicit bias, and also the actions that healthcare providers take on behalf of people struggling with substance use. So these are the two that have the most capacity for harm. So if you start anywhere, start with these. It's really easy to change from substance abuse to substance use. And why this is funny to me in a way is that as a former substance user, I did not abuse substances. I treated them better than a lot of times my friends and family, and also myself. So I share that with you because I always thought it was funny that they thought I abused substances when really I treated them so well. Other words or things that we hear in the community, such as junkie, crackhead, felon, it's really up to the individual to decide what to call themselves. But when we are pointing the finger and calling somebody and minimizing their worth by basically telling them that they're junkies and that they're worthless, we definitely need to stop and look at that and change the way that we're talking about things. These other words, compliant versus non-compliant, make it sound like in some studies that substance use is willful misconduct. So if I am following a plan of abstinence, for example, that I am given through the criminal justice system, and for example, I'm on probation or released from jail for theft, and I smoke marijuana and I end up in jail for a probation violation, you have to wonder, it seems like a legal reach to me, just personally, but it also makes me think, are they really being compliant, or are they adhering to your expectations? So I think that's a sensitive one right there, because it can use positively and negatively, I suppose. The words to elevate and basically replace in your everyday language are on the left, and they are words and concepts that we need to elevate while we work on eliminating the others. So for example, if you're posting on social media or you are sharing with friends and family, please use people first language. So for example, if you're having a conversation at Thanksgiving, for example, with family, and they start talking about the addicts over there, or the addicts on TV that they're seeing every day, just reframe it and say, those are people that struggle with substance use. They're people first. Secondly, substance use disorder, based on research, still has some negative connotation simply because the word disorder kind of hints at a problem. And what we learned from the research studies is that substance use disorder is less harmful. It does not mean it's without harm, but it's definitely less harmful than the words substance abuse and substance abuser. So I basically say substance use, like you'll see on the next line. If somebody is using substances, they're a person that uses substances. If they have stopped using substances and don't necessarily identify as being in addiction recovery, then they have some resolved use, and that's a success that we need to celebrate. If somebody has relapsed, for example, the word that we need to work on eliminating from our everyday language, to me, if addiction is really and truly seen as a disease and a brain disease, and we can see it basically on print in somebody's MRI, then to me, it's a recurrence of use and also a recurrence of symptoms related to that disease. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative thing. I always use the comparison to somebody with diabetes, as you can see in the person or the statement below. I have family members with diabetes, and I don't tell them that after they've had a piece of cake that they were dirty or that they've relapsed. To me, it's a recurrence of symptoms if their blood sugar should go up as a result of what they have eaten. Related to drug testing policies and procedures, whether it's at employment or treatment centers or with healthcare providers in the community, we can use words like positive and negative. It's positive for a substance, it's negative for a substance. It does not mean that they are clean or dirty or that their drug test is. And also, again, going back to people first language, let's talk about the person first and say the person who uses drugs or a person who injects drugs, as opposed to calling them a junkie, a crackhead, or a felon, for example. What we know about linguistics and language related to stigma is that there's also greater research on something called recovery dialects. And I'll use myself as an example. So for example, I'm a person in recovery. It is okay and also seen as a bonding moment when I am able to say to somebody, hi, I'm Jackie and I'm a recovering person. And I might say alcoholic, I might say addict, but that person understands me at a level that is not prejudicial or where they have the capacity to discriminate against me. It's really kind of an in-group way of talking to each other. However, when I'm in public or I'm with folks that I work with in treatment or I'm talking to a journalist, you will never hear me use those words. I will often say I'm a person in recovery. And what that means is that I haven't found it necessarily to take a drug or a drink since date. The reality is that we can see that some of these words matter in certain locations more than others. And that's really important to say. One, because if somebody says that they're an addict, that is the word that they have chosen to describe themselves, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have permission to call them that. This is a call to action since we're getting to the end point. And this is basically these are the recommendations that I make for you as community members, no matter where you work or what neighborhood you live in. We all have to work on removing the words that increase stigma from policy, organizational titles, committees, digital information, journalism. If you participate in an interview with a person that works in the media, definitely educate them on the impact of stigma and the language that they use and point them towards the American Press style book from 2017. I think that we also can have conversations with people every day where we provide some education on the words that they're using and how they impact you and also what you've learned today. I also think that we need to address calling people basically words, like I use the example of addict. It is not on me as a person without understanding the other person to call them an addict unless I'm in the in-group. So a lot of times we don't know any better, but the best way to find out what to call them is just to ask, what should I call you? Are you a person with an addiction? Are you a person in recovery? Or do you prefer to be called an addict? Because for a lot of people, that's a sense of empowerment. And last but not least, bring people with substance use disorders or struggling with addiction or drug users to the table to have conversations and also share their stories, especially in the community related to resources and networks. We need to be engaging folks in those communities because they have so much, one, it helps them to feel heard, and two, they have so much to offer the rest of us who sit around with great ideas of policy and programs. We really need to include them in the planning processes. And last but not least, I want to share this statistic primarily because when I first saw it, I thought, why does that make me feel so good? The reality is it makes me feel good because the number of people struggling with substance use disorder is less than the people living in recovery. However, if we don't have these conversations and we don't look critically at the media and also our own everyday language, you get the impression that it's not getting any better. And the reality is that it's been getting better for a long time. And most of us can see the stories of hope and empowerment that are showing up in our communities when we give them space to share those stories. Last but not least, it's 2 minutes, the end. So I don't know if you guys want to take time for questions, but I am open and also can be available for contact after today if you'd rather ask questions in private. So I am done, ladies and gentlemen.
Right, if people have questions, they can use the raise hand feature and I can enable the microphones.
Awesome. Any questions?
First up is screen name DeWilson.
Wait, what?
The first person who raised their hand is someone who's in the attendee list listed as DeWilson. So I've given them permission to talk, so they can enable their mic whenever they're ready.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, no worries.
They probably have to take themselves
I have a
up.
question.
Oh, good.
I was saying I do not have a question. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Anybody else?
Next up is Kay Hewitt.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, will the recording be posted anywhere?
I am able to post the recording,
Yep.
but I have not received a request from it. So when I have received a request, we can move on from there.
Okay, we'll make that request. Jackie, great job.
Thank you.
Okay, it doesn't look like there are any hands raised.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Jackie, so much. It was wonderful having you, and we appreciate all the great information that you shared on this Lunch and Learn. So thanks, everybody, for attending, and thanks, Jackie, for presenting.